History is often written by the victors, but sometimes it is carved into stone by those who were once deemed mere commodities. In the turbulent flow of time, there are stories buried under the dust of prejudice, where men born of the Black Continent, carrying the hot blood of the Ethiopian highlands, were chained and cast into a strange world across the ocean. They arrived in Asia not as envoys but as slaves, but fate is an unpredictable gambler. Those who were once stripped of their names, looked down upon by the white and yellow elites in the glittering courts of India, refused to bow. They stood up, seized the sword of the ruler, and with their own hands, placed the crown of ultimate power upon their heads. We are speaking of the Abyssinians, also known as the Habshis, the great usurpers who shook the foundations of Islamic empires in Bengal and the Deccan. But their ambition did not stop at seizing a blood-stained throne. They understood that flesh will rot, dynasties will crumble, and only stone and faith are eternal. Thus, they commissioned mosques gilded in gold, sky-piercing towers, and magnificent architectural feats as an arrogant challenge sent to time itself. These structures are a statement. We were here, we ruled, and we are civilization. Today, join me on a journey to retrace the footsteps of these slaves, to see that black history has never been solely a history of servitude. If you are moved by these tragic and heroic pages of history, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. That is how we keep the flame illuminating the past alive together. The journey begins now. Part 1. Stolen Roots in the Call of the Ocean. Before the first stones of the golden mosques were laid upon the damp soil of Bengal, our story begins much further away, on the windswept highlands of the Horn of Africa. This was Abyssinia, or modern-day Ethiopia, a land of ancient legends, where people lived with their heads held high amidst the clouds and rocky mountains. The men and women here were born with robust physiques, forged by the harsh sun and wind and the rugged terrain. They possessed an inner strength, a resilience that the world would later come to respect. But ironically, that very strength became the curse that made them targets for human traffickers. In the medieval centuries, the Indian Ocean was not just a route for silk and spices, but a river of blood and tears for tens of thousands of East Africans. Young Abyssinian men, in the prime of their lives, were torn from their families, herded like cattle from their familiar villages. Imagine the terror of a person who had never seen the sea, now stuffed into the dark hold of cramped towboats, drifting for months on an uncertain ocean. The smell of the salty sea mixed with the stench of fear, disease, and death. In the darkness of the hold, memories of home, the green mountains, a mother's song, the taste of coffee and teff gradually blurred, giving way to the rawest instinct for survival when the ships docked at the bustling ports of India or Bengal. These Abyssinians stepped ashore no longer as free men. They became Habshis, a name that signified both their origin and their label as foreign slaves. They were displayed in markets, valued based on their muscle, teeth, and endurance. But there was one thing the Asian merchants and nobility of that time did not foresee. They were not just buying manual laborers, they were purchasing born warriors, men in whose hearts the flame of resistance had never truly been extinguished. The land of Bengal, with its intricate network of rivers and hot, humid climate, was a world entirely different from the dry highlands of home. The environmental change was the first shock they had to overcome, but the Habshi people possessed an extraordinary ability to adapt. They learned new languages, learned to wield new weapons, and more importantly, they learned to observe. They saw the opulence of the palaces, the calculation in the eyes of court officials, and the frailty of monarchs living in silk. In the minds of those young slaves, a new realization began to kindle. They realized that in this strange land, power was the only law, and they who had nothing left to lose were precisely the strongest. The presence of the Habshi in Bengal was no accident. The sultans of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty, in an effort to consolidate power, no longer trusted the local aristocracy or the ambitious Turk and Afghan generals. They needed a force of absolute loyalty, men with no family to rely on, no land to govern. And so, thousands of Habshis were recruited into the imperial guard, given swords to protect the king's sleep. But history has proven that handing a sword to the oppressed is akin to raising a lion in one's home. Initially, it may be an obedient pet, protecting the master from wild wolves. But when the lion realizes its claws are sharper than its master's throne, the order will be overturned. The Habshi soldiers began to rise. From gatekeepers, they became commanders, then generals, and finally, the holders of the keys to the Forbidden Palace. They began to understand that loyalty is a luxury, and power is never granted, it must be seized. It was in this very context that the seeds of the great usurpation were sown, waiting for a rain of blood to sprout. And when the time came, they would not only demand their freedom, they would demand the entire realm. When the bare feet of the Abyssinian sons touched the hard ground of the bustling ports in Bengal or the Deccan, what greeted them was not freedom, but the chaos of the slave markets. This was where human dignity was stripped away, naked and ruthless. Imagine the scene: the scorching heat of the Asian tropics, the pungent scent of spices mingling with the smell of sweat and road dust. Amidst the clamor of 100 foreign tongues, black men stood there, silent as bronze statues in a sea of strangers. They were bound together by rough ropes, but what bound them tighter than any cord was the gaze of the buyers. Merchants, officials, and even generals of the royal court walked about, scrutinizing every fiber of muscle, every joint, just as one would choose a war. Strangers' hands felt their shoulders, pried open their mouths to check their teeth, valuing their strength with cold gold coins. It was a moment of ultimate humiliation, yet within that very moment, a paradox began to form. The white and yellow elites looked at them with the contempt reserved for slaves, but deep within that gaze flickered fear and a craving for the superior physical strength of the Africans. They needed these bodies to do the work that the jade-like hands of the nobility would never dare to touch. The Habshis quickly realized their peculiar position in this new society. They were placed at the very bottom of the social ladder, regarded as heathens, barbarians from a dark land. Yet, at the same time, they were sought after. Unlike indigenous slaves who were often sent to work in the fields, the Habshis, with their towering stature and extraordinary endurance, were often placed in more specialized roles: royal guards, imperial oarsmen, or wrestlers entertaining the palace. This first cultural collision was not gentle. It was a powerful shock. They had to learn to swallow their humiliation to survive, but in silence, they began to observe their enemies, the masters who held their lives in their hands. They noticed the weakness hidden beneath the layers of silk and brocade. These masters, though powerful, were indolent, pleasure-seeking, and lived in constant suspicion of one another. The Habshis realized that in this land loyalty was the scarcest commodity, and that very scarcity opened a narrow crack for the slaves. They were not just commodities. They were life and death tools that everyone wanted to possess. From the foul-smelling slave markets, they stepped into mansions and barracks, carrying with them not just chains, but a sky full of ambition waiting to erupt. Fate had brought them here as slaves, but the blood flowing in their veins remained the blood of free warriors, and no chain could forever lock away the soul of a sleeping conqueror. From the slave markets, the finest Habshi men were separated. They were not sent to the farms, but straight into military training camps. This was the decisive turning point that completely altered their destiny. Why did the sultans of Bengal hand weapons to foreign slaves? The answer lay in the paranoia of power. The kings of that era were besieged by threats from those closest to them. The local nobility was full of schemes, while the Turk or Afghan generals were always plotting to usurp the throne. In that context, the Habshis became the perfect choice. They were rootless. They had no powerful families here, no lands to defend, and in theory, their sole purpose in life was to serve the master who had bought them. And so, hands once accustomed to herding livestock on the Ethiopian highlands now began to familiarize themselves with the coldness of steel. They learned to wield curved scimitars to shoot arrows from horseback, and to organize formations to protect the king's carriage. The rigorous training awakened the warrior instinct dormant within them. When a man holds a weapon in his hand, his mindset changes. He is no longer one who bows to orders. He becomes a wielder of life and death. The clash of swords became their new language, a language more authoritative than any spoken word. Within the army, the Habshis rose rapidly thanks to their bravery and iron discipline. They became the imperial guard, the living wall separating the king from the conspiracy-filled world outside. But ironically, by handing the slave a sword to protect the throne, the king inadvertently taught him how to seize it. The Habshi soldiers began to see their true strength. They saw court officials tremble before their blades, saw the king depend on their protection every single second. The sensation of power began to seep into their minds, replacing their initial fear. They realized that in this bloody Game of Thrones, it is the one holding the sword who has the deciding voice, not the one sitting on the throne. And thus, the loyal guards were gradually transforming into wolves stalking right beside their prey. From the slave markets, the finest Habshi men were separated. They were not sent to the farms, but straight into military training camps. This was the decisive turning point that completely altered their destiny. Why did the sultans of Bengal hand weapons to foreign slaves? The answer lay in the paranoia of power. The kings of that era were besieged by threats from those closest to them. The local nobility was full of schemes, while the Turk or Afghan generals were always plotting to usurp the throne. In that context, the Habshis became the perfect choice. They were rootless. They had no powerful families here, no lands to defend, and in theory, their sole purpose in life was to serve the master who had bought them. And so, hands once accustomed to herding livestock on the Ethiopian highlands now began to familiarize themselves with the coldness of steel. They learned to wield curved scimitars to shoot arrows from horseback, and to organize formations to protect the king's carriage. The rigorous training awakened the warrior instinct dormant within them. When a man holds a weapon in his hand, his mindset changes. He is no longer one who bows to orders. He becomes a wielder of life and death. The clash of swords became their new language, a language more authoritative than any spoken word. Within the army, the Habshis rose rapidly thanks to their bravery and iron discipline. They became the imperial guard, the living wall separating the king from the conspiracy-filled world outside. But ironically, by handing the slave a sword to protect the throne, the king inadvertently taught him how to seize it. The Habshi soldiers began to see their true strength. They saw court officials tremble before their blades, saw the king depend on their protection every single second. The sensation of power began to seep into their minds, replacing their initial fear. They realized that in this bloody Game of Thrones, it is the one holding the sword who has the deciding voice, not the one sitting on the throne. And thus, the loyal guards were gradually transforming into wolves, stalking right beside their prey. When the heavy gates of the royal palace closed, the outside world was left behind, leaving only the terrifying silence of power. There, standing tall along the long winding corridors and directly behind the glittering throne, were the Habshi soldiers. They were clad in gleaming armor, hands gripping sword hilts, eyes staring straight ahead, motionless as divine statues carved from black stone. Their status was now different. They were no longer the naked slaves at the harbor. They had become the living shield of the king, the final boundary between the monarch's life and death. The king trusted them more than his own flesh and blood, believing that these rootless men would have no reason to betray him. But the king's trust was a thorn in the side of the Asian elite, the white-skinned Turkic officials, the long-bearded Afghan generals, and the indigenous Bengal nobility looked at these black guards with eyes full of malice and contempt. In lavish banquets, where wine flowed freely and melodious music played, whispering jibes still reached the ears of the Habshi. They were called black demons, barbarian savages lucky enough to wear silk. The nobility considered it an insult to their noble lineage that foreign slaves stood as equals in the court. They mocked the Habshis for their clumsiness in courtly rituals. But they forgot one thing. Those clumsy at holding a wine goblet were masters at slitting throats. Tension crept into every corner of the palace. The Habshis silently endured the disdain. But within those muscular chests, a storm was gathering. They recognized the hypocrisy of the ruling class. Those who despised their skin color were the very ones who trembled and hid behind their backs whenever turmoil arose. Standing closest to the throne, the Habshis heard every secret, saw through every fear of the king, and more importantly, they saw the rot of the entire system. They began to ask themselves, why do those weak and cowardly men have the right to rule, while strong and loyal men like us must bow? The contempt of the elite, instead of drowning the Habshi will, inadvertently became the fuel that ignited their ambition. They understood that to cease being despised, the only way was to stand above all, higher even than the throne they were protecting. Loyalty, after all, is just a gamble. As the Ilya Shahi dynasty began its slide into decline, the later kings became weak and paranoid. Sultan Jalaluddin Fateh Shah, in the delirium of power, committed a fatal error. He began to fear the very knife he had sharpened. The king tried to curb the growing power of the Habshi imperial guard by punishing them for trivial mistakes. And worse, he began to listen to the instigations of the envious nobility. Soldiers who were once ready to die for the king now felt the blade of betrayal against their own throats. A brutal law of politics was exposed: when the hound becomes too large, the hunter will want to slaughter it in the dark of night. Within the barracks of the Imperial Guard, secret meetings began to take place. No longer were there oaths of patriotic loyalty, but calculations for survival. Their leader, a powerful and ambitious eunuch named Shahzada, saw opportunity in the chaos. He realized that this dynasty was like an ancient tree, hollowed out from within. A mere push would cause it to collapse. Why continue to protect a king who wants to kill us? Why leave the fate of thousands of Habshi brothers in the hands of madmen? The seeds of betrayal did not sprout from causeless greed, but stemmed from the instinct of self-defense. They were backed into a corner, and a wounded beast is the most dangerous beast of all. The atmosphere in the palace became suffocating, like the air before a great storm. Glances exchanged were full of scrutiny. The Habshis still stood there, guarding the king's sleep, but the way their hands rested on their sword hilts had changed. They no longer gripped their swords to draw against external enemies. They were measuring the distance from where they stood to the king's neck. The boundary between protector and assassin was as fragile as a thread, and when the midnight bell tolled, signaling the transition between day and night, it was also the moment they decided to cross that line. History was about to witness a spectacular use where slaves decided, if no one gives us respect, we will take it with blood. That night, the Bengal palace was submerged in a deceptive silence, like the calm sea surface before a tsunami strikes. The wind blowing from the Ganges carried a chill, winding through marble corridors, flickering the dim torches on the walls. Sultan Jalaluddin Fateh Shah had gone to sleep, carrying the naive belief that the fortified walls and the mighty imperial guard would keep his imperial dreams intact. He was unaware that the Reaper was not coming from outside the city gates, but was standing right beside his bed, in the guise of those he once considered his most loyal slaves. Sasad, the leader of the Habshi army, walked through the darkness with soundless steps. He carried not only a cold, sharp blade, but also the suppressed resentment of an entire exiled people. The moment the sword swung, It not only severed the throat of a king but also cut the invisible chains that had bound the Habshi mind for so many years. The Sultan's blood stained the gold-embroidered silk blanket crimson, marking the tragic end of the once illustrious Shahi dynasty. In that instant, the cosmic order seemed overturned. The servant had become the regicide. Darkness had swallowed the light of royalty. When dawn broke, news of the king's death spread like a wildfire. The palace descended into absolute chaos. Screams, wailing, and the clash of swords echoed everywhere. But amidst that storm, Shahzada and his Habshi warriors stood firm like black rocks in a flood. They did not run. They had crossed the red line, and there was no turning back. Shahzada stepped up to the throne, which still held the warmth of the fallen, and declared a new era. This audacious act was not merely a political coup. It was a slap in the face to the Asian elite, a fierce assertion that power does not belong to those of noble blood, but to those who dare to spill blood to seize it. Seizing the throne is one thing, but holding it is an entirely different story. When Shahzada, now calling himself Sultan Babak Shah, placed the jeweled crown of Bengal upon his head, he immediately felt its crushing weight. It was not the weight of gold and gems, but the weight of the surrounding hostility. For the first time in the history of this land, a black man, a former slave, sat at the highest position, looking down upon a court of arrogant Turks, fierce Afghans, and learned Brahmin intellectuals. In their bowed eyes was not respect, but disgust and plotting. They viewed this as an insult to history, a stain that needed to be cleansed. Babak Shah's reign began in suspicion and fear. He understood that he was sitting on a pyre. To consolidate power, the new king was forced to implement an iron fist policy. He purged all those who intended to oppose him, replacing key positions with his Habshi brothers. The palace became an isolated fortress, where the king dared not trust anyone other than those of the same skin color and plight. But this very isolation only deepened the chasm between the Habshi court and the rest of society. The common people looked up at the palace with fear, while the old nobility retreated into the shadows, sharpening their own knives. The crown on Babak Shah's head was truly a crown of thorns. Every passing day was a psychological battle for survival. He realized that power seized by violence would always be threatened by violence. A sense of insecurity gnawed at the slave king's soul. He tried to use opulence to mask his anxiety, organizing lavish banquets and distributing bounties. But it was all merely makeup painted on the face of a corpse. Babak Shah had reached a pinnacle of fame that no slave dared to dream of. But the price to pay was absolute loneliness atop that cold peak of power. When the blood on the swords had dried and the screams of the Kunite had faded into the past, a new monster began to rise within the minds of the Habshi kings, more persistent and terrifying than any sword-wielding enemy: the obsession with legitimacy. Babak Shah and later Saifuddin Firuz Shah both understood a bitter truth. Even if they sat on the highest throne, draped in the most magnificent imperial robes in the eyes of the Brahmin nobility or foreign envoys, they remained merely lowly usurpers. The label of slave was like a birthmark on their skin. No holy water could wash it away, and no perfume could mask it. Usurped power might force people to bow in fear, but it could not compel respect from the depths of their hearts. To fill this immense void, the Habshi sultans turned to an ally greater and more sacred than any earthly power: faith. They realized that in the vast Islamic world, before God, all believers are equal. If bloodlines could not grant them legitimacy, then piety would. They began to style themselves as swords of the faith, as protectors of the faithful, on newly minted gold coins. Instead of inscribing their lineage, which they either lacked or wished to bury, they engraved noble religious titles, proclaiming that their power was granted by the grace of God, not seized through theft. This was a sophisticated psychological war. By becoming the most ardent patrons of Islam, the Habshi kings intended to send a fierce message to the hypocritical elite: you may despise my blood, but you cannot despise my faith. They wanted to prove that a man born in chains could become a more virtuous king than anyone born in silk. That ostentatious piety served as both a protective shield and a sedative to soothe the deep-seated inferiority complex of men who always felt like outsiders on their own thrones. They ruled not only by law but through a desperate effort to be recognized as part of the civilized world, to blur the line between master and servant in the eyes of the divine. Once political power had been consolidated with swords and faith, the Habshi kings began to set their sights on a grander ambition: eternity. They understood that men would die, dynasties would decline, but stone remains forever. Thus, a brilliant era of construction exploded across the land of Bengal. This was not merely about building places of worship, it was a campaign to create a legacy. Men once deemed barbaric and uncultured now decided to leave their mark on the earth with the most magnificent architectural works, things that neither time nor oblivion could erase. Under the patronage of Saifuddin Firuz Shah, construction sites sprang up everywhere. The sound of hammers and chisels replaced the clash of swords. The smell of mortar overpowered the scent of gunpowder. They did not choose the delicate, ethereal architectural style of the Persians. Instead, they chose a style that bore the heavy imprint of their African roots: solid, majestic, and full of power. Thick walls and massive domes were built to challenge even the fiercest tropical storms, but the most distinctive feature, the thing that made the world gasp in awe, was the use of gold. Why gold? Because gold never rusts. Gold is the symbol of ultimate authority and infinite wealth. Mosques began to have their domes and decorative patterns gilded, shining brilliantly under the Bengal sun like beacons of power. The most iconic structure, the Choto Sona Masjid small golden mosque, was not just a temple, it was a manifesto in stone and pure gold. It screamed to the world, look, the slaves of yesterday have now created heaven on earth, for the Habshi's architecture was not decoration, it was self-assertion. Every brick laid was a negation of their slave past, a desperate yet proud effort to etch their names into the endless flow of human history. Part 10. Bricks of faith and power. If history is a river that washes away old memories, then architecture consists of the boulders that stem the flow, preserving the past for eternity. For the Habshi kings, building was not merely stacking bricks upon one another. It was a proud dialogue between the indigenous culture of Bengal and the deep-seated memories of their African homeland. They did not blindly copy the styles of those who came before. Instead, they created a distinct architectural language. Powerful and sinewy, much like the bodies of the black soldiers themselves, they rejected weak materials. Instead, they commissioned the mining of black basalt from the distant Rajmahal hills. This stone was hard, cold, and pitch black at choice, full of subtext, as if to honor the skin color of those now holding the reins of power. Under the talented hands of craftsmen, those rough blocks of stone were transformed into works of art. They combined a black stone with the traditional red terracotta of Bengal, creating a visually striking contrast. The red of the earth, of blood and life, blending with the black of authority, mystery, and eternity. On those thick walls, there were no images of humans or animals, as Islamic law strictly forbade idolatry. But the Habshis filled that void with winding vine motifs, stylized lotus flowers, and lines of Arabic calligraphy carved so exquisitely that one might mistake them for brushstrokes on silk rather than engravings on stone. Most distinctive were the domes. Instead of the soaring, onion-shaped domes of the Persian style, they chose low, broad, sturdy domes, like bare backs straining to support the sky. And then, they covered them with glistening pure gold. These golden mosques were not just places of prayer, they were open-air treasuries, an assertion that the Habshis did not come here to plunder and leave, but to build and bequeath the most brilliant legacies to this land. Every brick was soaked in the sweat of the worker and the ambition of the king, creating a tragic and heroic symphony between religion and power. Part 11. Saifuddin, Firuz Shah, the architect king among the usurpers bearing African blood. One name shone brighter than all, not for brutality, but for chivalry and grand vision. Saifuddin Firuz Shah, originally a brilliant general named Malik Andal. He was a man whose initial loyalty to the old dynasty was so deep that he only accepted the throne when there was no other choice to save the country from chaos. Unlike his predecessor Babak Shah, who lived in constant fear and suspicion, Firuz Shah carried the demeanor of a true monarch. He understood that a throne built by swords could only be sustained by benevolence. The reign of Firuz Shah, though brief, lasting only 3 years, is considered the golden age of the Habshis in Bengal. He opened granaries to feed the poor, patronized scholars and poets, and most importantly, poured his heart and soul into architecture. The greatest legacy he left behind is the Firuz Minor in the capital of Gaur. Imagine a 5-story tower piercing the sky, standing over 25 meters tall, built entirely of crimson terracotta bricks. It stands there, solitary and proud, unattached to any mosque, like a monument to the king himself. The structure of the Firuz Minor is a marvel. The lower 3 stories are 12-sided polygons, symbolizing the complexity of the earthly world, while the upper 2 stories are perfectly round, reaching towards heaven. Inside the tower lies a spiral staircase leading to the top, where the king could cast his gaze over the entire realm he ruled. For Firuz Shah, this tower was not merely a military structure to spot enemies. It was a bridge between earth and sky, the finger of the Habshi pointing straight at the sun, declaring to the divine their undeniable presence. Under his reign, the people of Bengal began to forget the king's slave origins. They saw before them only a great sultan, the one who turned the capital of Gaur into a jewel of the East. He proved that the soul of a king does not depend on the blood flowing in his veins, but on what he builds for the world. Part 12. The shadow of brutality. The fate of usurpers seems always to be haunted by a curse. Greatness often dies young, while madness persists. After the sudden death of the enlightened King Firuz Shah, the Bengal throne fell into the hands of Shamsuddin Muzaffar Shah, a Habshi man possessing ambition larger than the sky, but a heart colder than the stones of a crypt. If Firuz Shah ruled with virtue, Muzaffar Shah ruled with pure terror. He believed that benevolence was a sign of weakness, and only a blood-soaked blade could keep his head securely on his shoulders. The capital of Gaur, once echoing with poetry and prayers, now became a vast prison without bars. Muzaffar Shah initiated a campaign of brutal purges unprecedented in history. He saw enemies everywhere, in the eyes of the cupbearer and the smiles of concubines, and especially in the silence of the old nobility. Executions took place publicly in the marketplaces. Heads rolling on the red brick pavement became a fierce warning to anyone daring to dream of resistance. He raised taxes to unimaginable levels to amass wealth, hoarding gold and silver in deep vaults, as if trying to use riches to fill the abyss of insecurity within his soul. But Muzaffar Shah's greatest tragedy was not his brutality, but his solitude. He turned his back on his own Habshi brothers, suspecting even those who had once faced death alongside him. He recruited thousands of new mercenaries of mixed ethnicities, hoping that money could buy the loyalty that blood could not guarantee. The court became suffocated by the stench of death and suspicion. The king locked himself in the forbidden palace, unable to eat or sleep well, always keeping weapons close at hand. Power, the very thing he yearned to seize at any cost, had now turned into a poison gnawing at his mind every day. Muzaffar Shah had turned his kingdom into a graveyard, not realizing that he was digging his own grave. In the dense jungle of politics, when the old lion goes mad and mauls its own pride, that is when the wise old foxes begin to leave their dens. The Asian elite, the Turks, Arabs and Bengal nobility had remained silent for years under the boot of the Habshi. They had endured humiliation, seen their temples overshadowed by the golden mosques of the foreigners, but they were not dead. They were merely waiting, and their moment arrived in the form of a cunning vizier named Sayyid Hussein. Sayyid Hussein was the embodiment of patience and craftiness. He served under the tyrant Muzaffar Shah, bowing the lowest, cheering the loudest, and appearing the most diligent. But behind that deferential smile was a mind calculating every move to overturn the chessboard. Hussein saw through the fractures within the Habshi army. He secretly allied with disgruntled generals, bribed guards, and incited fury among the populace groaning under heavy taxation. He whispered into the ears of the nobility that the reign of these slaves was an aberration of nature, and their mission was to bring the old order back. The uprising did not begin with a loud explosion, but with the tightening of a siege. Sayyid Hussein led a coalition of the discontented to surround the capital of Ghor. It was a prolonged war lasting for months. Inside the walls, Muzaffar Shah frantically screamed orders, but the only response he received was the coldness of soldiers who had lost all faith. Outside the walls, Sayyid Hussein was in no rush to attack. He waited for hunger and despair to do the work of swords. He knew that a fortress collapses from within much faster than it is breached from without. The Habshis, once mighty hunters, had now become prey cornered in a dead end. They realized that muscular strength and golden towers could not save them from history's vengeance. The scales of power were tipping, and this time they were tipping back toward the old masters. Every empire born of violence carries within it the seed of destruction, and the Habshi dynasty was no exception. After months of siege, the gates of the capital Ghor finally swung open, not by the force of catapults, but by betrayal from within. Sayyid Hussein, with the cunning of an old fox, persuaded Muzaffar Shah's own guards to lay down their arms. The moment the tyrant fell in a pool of his own blood, it was not merely the death of an individual, but the death knell for an entire era. The dream of a black kingdom in the heart of Asia collapsed as quickly as a sandcastle before a fierce wave. The victor's vengeance was more brutal than any nightmare. Sayyid Hussein, now Sultan Alauddin Hussein Shah, issued a ruthless decree of expulsion. He declared that the Habshis were too dangerous, too powerful, and too difficult to control to remain in Bengal. Thousands of Habshi men, women, and children who had come to consider this land their second home were once again stripped of everything. They were driven from their homes, stripped of their possessions, and forced to leave. History repeated itself painfully. Their ancestors were kidnapped from Africa to come here, and now their descendants were being driven away from the place they had shed blood to build. The stream of Habshi people silently left Bengal, scattering westward to Gujarat and the Deccan, carrying with them resentment and memories of a fleeting golden age. They departed, leaving behind desolate palaces and empty thrones. But in that tragic exodus, they still held their heads high. They had lost the battle for the throne, but they had won against the fate of slavery. They had dared to dream the imperial dream, dared to touch the sun even if their wings were scorched. The twilight that fell upon the Habshi dynasty was not the end of darkness, but the brilliant red of blood and fire, a tragic and heroic ending worthy of warriors who never submitted. 500 years have passed since the last Habshi left the Bengal throne. Weeds have overgrown the old battlefields, and the names of the slave kings have faded in human memory. But there are things that time, war, or prejudice cannot destroy. Architecture. Today, if you step into Gwar or Pandua on the border between India and Bangladesh, you will still see them standing there, the golden mosques, the towering watchtowers, the sullen black stone walls challenging the ages. The layer of pure gold may have been scraped away by the greedy, but the essence of the structures remains intact. The Firuz miner still pierces the sky, like an accusing finger from the past sent to the present. The Choto Sona Masjid retains its majesty, with exquisite carvings telling the story of a miraculous cultural blend between Africa and Asia. Stone does not lie. Those stones are the fiercest evidence refuting the stereotype that black people in history were merely passive slaves. No, they were builders, rulers, patrons of the arts. They left a part of their souls in the earth and stone of Bengal, turning this place into a living museum of the power of human will. The story of the Habshi kings is a reminder that history is not a monotonous straight line. It is full of unexpected turns, where the weakest can rise to seize their destiny. Though their reign was as brief as a lightning bolt, that lightning tore through the night, illuminating a truth. Human dignity does not lie in the chains they wear, but in what they dare to do to break them. The slave kings are gone, but their legacy is immortal, silently flowing in the underground currents of human civilization, waiting for people like us to come, listen, and retell. From the cramped slave ships on the Indian Ocean to the glittering throne in Bengal, from the status of servants to the stature of monarchs, the Habshi prove that no limit is unbreakable. Their legacy is not just stone towers, but the flame of resilience burning forever in the hearts of the children of the Black Continent around the world. History is a long river, and our task is not to stand on the bank judging the water, but to bend down and drink the lessons from it. If this story of the golden mosques and these slave kings has touched your heart, please do not keep it to yourself. Share it, so the world knows that black people were once great emperors in the East. Remember, every follow is a drop of water contributing to the great river of humanity, helping us continue the journey of excavating the buried gems of history. Goodbye, and see you on the next journey of discovery.